My grandmothers were strong. They followed plows and bent to toil. They moved through fields sowing seed. They touched earth and grain grew. They were full of sturdiness and singing. My grandmothers were strong. My grandmothers are full of memories, smelling of soap and onions and wet clay, with veins rolling roughly over quick hands. They have many clean words to say. My grandmothers are strong. Why am I not as they? So my grandmothers, I had my grandmother on my father's side and my grandmother on my mother's side. My grandmother on my father's side always wanted you better than you were. No matter what you brought home to her, she would say, is this it? Is this the best you can do? And she would say that sometimes when I heard it, I thought, wow, I'm working so hard. But I grew to understand that she loved me so well that she expected greater things from me than I could ever see from myself. Wow. And that is a thing that I think all of us are called on to help all the young people who come into our purview, anybody who comes in our sphere, whoever we are, to help you see in yourself greatness that you may not understand, you may not know. I didn't come into the world. I was talking to a student the other day who said, I never thought about being a professor. Neither did I. I didn't know that was a profession you could choose. I got to college and one of my colleagues said, well, I sure hope I get to be a professor and come back here and teach. And I thought, can you do that? How do you do that? I grew up the child of a laborer and of a teacher's assistant. And he wanted me to be able to stand on my own 2 feet, and he wanted me to be educated. But after I finished college, he thought that was pretty good. Go get a job. Start working. But I kept going to school and going to school and going to school. And my baby sister said finally to my mama, is Dee ever going to finish? Is she ever getting out of school? Do we just have to keep going until you get old like she is? So, but my grandmother expected more. And so I kept trying to deliver. Artists also help us cherish memories closer to our own lives that help us see and understand both the joys and the difficulties of those lives. And so there's a favorite poem of mine also I want to call your attention to, Nikki Rosa by Nikki Giovanni. I know not a lot of you know that one, but here it goes. Childhood remembrances are always a drag if you're black. You always remember things like living in Woodlawn with no inside toilet. And if you become famous or something, they never talk about how happy you were to have your mother all to yourself. And how good the water felt when you got your bath from one of those big tubs that folk in Chicago barbecue in. And somehow, when you talk about home, it never gets across how much you understood their feelings as the whole family attended meetings about Hollydale. And even though you remember, your biographers never understand your father's pain as he sells his stock and another dream goes. And though you're poor, it isn't poverty that concerns you. And though they fought a lot, it isn't your father's drinking that makes any difference, but only that everybody is together. And you and your sister have happy birthdays and very good Christmases. And I really hope no white person ever has cause to write about me because they never understand. Black love is black wealth. And they'll probably talk about my hard childhood and never understand that all the while I was quite happy. So one of the things that I turn to the literature for is to hear these words that help me understand things about my own childhood and about my own growing up and what it is that I wanted to give to my children and what I want for my grandchildren and for everybody's child. I want everybody's child, whatever circumstances they are in, to see the beauties of that life Because there are always some beauty somewhere, no matter how hard the life is.
That's right.
There are graces everywhere, if we have eyes to see. So confronting and understanding ourselves through our past also requires that we exercise some virtues. Now in my class again, here I go as a teacher, teaching folks about having intellectual humility, having intellectual courage, and intellectual perseverance. And we know that those work for spiritual humility, spiritual courage, spiritual perseverance. We have to be humble. And to be humble, as I explain to my students, that means we have to have some honesty. We have to acknowledge the gifts God gives us. But we have to also acknowledge that there are places where we fall down and things that we don't have. There's always somebody, I tell my students, there's always somebody, and when you graduate, there'll be somebody sitting on the right-hand side of you who is so smart. You can't believe that you get to sit in the same group with that person who's graduating. And on the other side, there'll be somebody who was so slack. You cannot believe that person is getting to graduate with you. But that's the way it is in life, that we don't always get to choose and to know who gets to go where. That's not our job. That's not our work. God takes care of that. But intellectual humility is really important. It helps us to understand that no matter how high you get to stand, there are people who stand taller, and there are people, and you get to stand where you are because you're standing on the shoulders of some other people.
Yes.
And Alice Walker reminds us of that. She says, and so our mothers and grandmothers have, more often than not, anonymously, handed on the creative spark and the seed of the flower they themselves never hoped to see, or like a sealed letter they could not plainly read. I think one of the things I want to share with you today is to remember that the work that we do as human beings, just living, looking out for each other, looking out for our families, trying to be the best people we know how to be. Sometimes we get really discouraged because we don't see the fruit. As a teacher, I can tell you that sometimes you are out there in the classroom and you're watching the people, and sometimes my students are very honest with me, my freshmen. They will in a minute just nod off. And I will say, so I guess I'm not being as exciting, as scintillating, and as inspiring as I'm hoping. And sometimes you go home and you have that stack of papers and you're working your way through it and you think, well, am I doing anything? What am I doing? What is this for? You're not always given to see. You are not always gifted to see the fruits of your labor, but you must labor anyway.
That's right.
Whether or not people congratulate you or pat you on the back for doing the right thing, you have to do the right thing anyway. And I keep getting that message, and I'm told again and again through the work that I find in the literature. There's a famous poem by Langston Hughes. It's called Mother to Son. And when I was a young person, people would get up every time there was a Black History Month or something, somebody would hear that poem. But if you haven't heard it in a while, I'd like to hear it this morning. Langston Hughes writes this poem in the voice of a mother speaking to a young man. But we all need to hear it as our mother speaking to us, and as we speak to our young children, mothers and fathers. Well, son, I'll tell you, life for me ain't been no crystal state. It's had tacks on it, and splinters, and boards torn up, and places with no carpet on the floor, bare. But all the time, I've been climbing on, and reaching landings, and turning corners, and sometimes going in the dark where there ain't been no light. So boy, don't you turn back. Don't you sit down on them steps, because you find it's kind of hard. Don't you fall now. Well, I still going, honey. I still climbing. And life for me ain't been no crystal state. So I think when we hear these words and we hear them coming from our past, artists give us that ear. They hold up that mirror so that we get a chance to see ourselves and encourage us and remind us what we're here to do, to help each other, to love each other, to lift each other up. Jesus has no other hands but our hands, no other feet but our feet to do the work in the world. From my girlhood, I heard that poem declaimed, don't fall down and stay down. Get on up. Get on up. We all fall down, but you need to get up. And we need sometimes to help each other up. Artists remind us also that we don't control everything. I believe that God has everything in his hands. And from one of my favorite stories by James Baldwin, the mother of 2 young men, realizing that she will probably not live to see her firstborn return from World War II, she tries to help one son see how he needs to take care of his brother. The brother has an addiction. He's addicted to heroin, the younger brother. And the older brother is in the army. He's the good brother. He's the good son. And so the mother is saying to the good son, I need you. I may not be around. I need to know that you are going to look after your brother. And this is the dialogue they have. I think this is a really important message. She says, you got to hold on to your brother, she said, and don't let him fall, no matter what it looks like is happening to him, and no matter how evil you get with him, because you're going to be evil. And he says, because he's young and cocky, I won't let nothing happen to Sonny. My mother smiled as if she were amused at something she saw in my face. Then she said, you may not be able to stop nothing from happening, but you got to let him know you are there. So one of the things that artists call us to is to remind us that whatever our gifts, whatever our opportunities have been, we can always stand with each other. We can let people know that we are there. We can offer an encouraging word. And we are called to do that. We are called to lift each other up, to hold each other up, to help each other get through. I believe the Lord calls us to do that in whatever way we are given to work. Alice Walker says again, it's so clear that you have to cherish everyone. I think that's what I get from these older black women, that every soul is to be cherished, that every flower is to bloom, and that needs our help. Maya Angelou tells us also about an opportunity, a friend who helped her. You all know Sister Maya, and we miss her every day, Sister Maya Angelou. And in her book, I Know Why the Caged Bird Sings, she tells about a time when she was 8 or 9 years old, and she had gone through a terrible trauma. And after that trauma, she returned to Stamps, Arkansas to live with her grandmother. God bless grandmothers everywhere, and great-grandmothers who take over those children and help raise them up and keep them in the straight. Because don't we know that there were so many of us who would have been lost without that grandmother, without those grandmothers, without those aunts, without that community. And she talks about returning to Stamps as a 9-year-old. She has been through such trauma that she no longer speaks. She doesn't speak at all. There's a whole year passes through her life when she doesn't talk at all. And there's a woman in the community, Mrs. Flowers. Now, I'm not sure what it is that Mrs. Flowers does, but she has the demeanor of a teacher. And she's very, to Maya's young eyes, she's very sophisticated and very well spoken and educated. And Maya's grandmother, whom she loves, is not. So she gets embarrassed every time Mrs. Flowers speaks to her grandmother, because her grandmother speaks back in her dialect, and Maya says, no, Grandma, you left out the verbs. You're not saying it the right way. You're breaking up the English. But Mrs. Flowers recognizes a sister. Mrs. Flowers has no illusion that because she speaks English one way and Maya's grandmother speaks English another way, that they're not sisters of the soul. They have the same work to do. They have the same work to do. She respects her. And when she sees that Maya will not speak, she joins her sister, Maya's grandmother, in trying to pull her out. And she calls to her and says, come and spend some time with me. Let Maya come spend some time with me. And very gently over the next year, she draws her out. She starts her reading. She starts her talking to her. She gives her lemonade. They sit down and have cookies or lemonade in the heat. And eventually, Maya Angelou finds her voice again. And we know that it's because Mrs. Flowers saw her.